was a science. The Soviet state and Soviet society were organized on abstract scientific principles. Studied systematically and properly applied, these principles made it possible to anticipate the consequences of decisions, behaviors, even attitudes. War-making, too, was a science. The application of its objective principles by trained and skilled engineers was the best predictor of victory. In that matrix, a rising generation of technocrats saw the Soviet Union's military future in terms of a mass mechanized army. In the mid-1920s, instructors at the Red Army Military Academy described the total destruction of enemy forces by a series of deep operations, shock armies for breakthrough, mobile echelons for exploitation and pursuit. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, appointed Deputy People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs in 1931, was the focal point of a school of thought arguing that mechanization vitalized and extended Revolutionary War. A technologized mass army could export communism as well as defend it. Reluctant soldiers would be transformed into enthusiasts by experiencing directly what the Soviet Union could do to its enemies. They would become part of a new proletariat, able to make optimum use of the military technologies created under communism. Stalin internalized and epitomized the conviction that the non-communist world embodied an irreconcilable hatred for the Soviet system. Even the Great Depression did not change his mind. Capitalism in its death throes might be even more willing to undo history by turning its armed forces against the USSR. However intensely managers, soldiers, and officials might dispute specific policies or details of production, the basic assumption of isolation in a mortally hostile world went unchallenged throughout the period. Moderation in defense planning was criminal. Cycles of purge, disruption, and reorganization characterized the defense industry well before they became a general norm in the late 1930s. The Red Army's unwavering support for Stalin in the intra-party struggles of the 1920s reflected its appreciation for Stalin's support of military spending at the expense of balanced budgets and civilian production to a permanent half-war, half-peace level. Deep battle became a comprehensive doctrine that included air-supported, fully mechanized mobile groups taking the fight into the enemy's rear at a rate of 25 or 30 miles a day. By 1938, the Soviet order of battle included 4 tank corps and a large number of tank brigades. But in November 1939, these formations were disbanded, replaced by motorized divisions and tank brigades designed essentially for close infantry support. One reason for this measure, the public one, was that the Spanish Civil War had shown the relative vulnerability of tanks, while large armored formations had proved difficult to control both against the Japanese in Mongolia and during the occupation of eastern Poland. Reinforcing operational experience was Stalin's concern for the armored force as a potential domestic threat. Not only were the top-level advocates of mobile war, men like Tukhachevsky, eliminated, all but one commander at brigade level and 80% of the battalion commanders were replaced as well. The successes of Hitler's panzers combined with the winding down of the purges to encourage reappraisal. Beginning in 1940, the People's Commissariat of Defense began authorizing what became a total of 29 mechanized corps, each with 2 tank divisions and a motorized division, 36,000 men and over 1,000 tanks each, plus 20 more brigades of 300 light T-26 tanks intended for infantry support. The numbers are mind-boggling even by subsequent Soviet reckoning. But low maintenance standards kept field strength down, and the sheer size of the mechanized corps defied all but the best efforts at command and control. As the Germans drove toward Moscow in 1941, the Red Army began rebuilding virtually from the ground up. Infantry, the rifle divisions, remained the backbone, but their authorized strength was reduced to around 11,000, and their supporting arms and services were cut to minimums. Even vehicles were reduced by 2/3, and most of those were horse-drawn. These frugal formations were supplemented by a large number of brigades less than half their size. The new structures reflected not only the heavy losses in men and equipment during Barbarossa, but also the fact that effective command of more complex formations was simply beyond the skill of the colonels and junior generals who took the places of those killed, captured, or replaced. Higher command structures were correspondingly simplified. Divisions, 4 or 5, sometimes more, were for a time assigned directly to rifle armies, which also controlled most of the service and support elements. During 1942, as supplies of armor and artillery increased, communications improved, and staff work grew more competent, the rifle corps re-emerged to enhance flexibility. A rifle army might field 3 or 4 of them, each with 3 or 4 divisions, sometimes upgraded from the independent brigades, which disappeared in their turn. Divisional allocations of guns and automatic weapons increased, but the bulk of supporting assets remained pooled at army level, assigned as needed. Throughout 1942, Soviet rifle formations were seldom anywhere near their authorized numbers. In theory and practice, they were regarded as expendable, to be kept in the line until reduced to cadre strength, then either broken up or completely rebuilt. Shock troops or cannon fodder. It depended on perspective. 19-year-old Boris Gorbachevsky entered the army in January 1942. He first saw combat in August, in front of Kiev, in a mixed-bag rifle company of Russians, Ukrainians, Cossacks, and Uzbeks. We now no longer belong to ourselves. We have all been seized by the incomprehensibly savage element of battle. Shell bursts, shell fragments, and bullets are sweeping away the infantry lines. The remnants of former companies and battalions have turned into a senseless mass of onward-charging, desperate men. Like so many Red Army attacks in 1942, this one collapsed in a welter of blood and bodies. Wounded and hospitalized, Gorbachevsky encountered his regiment's communist youth organizer, also a casualty. How are we fighting? Everyone from the army commander down to the company commander drives the soldiers forward into the chopping machine. And the result? We don't have enough paper for all the funeral notices. Yet many a veteran Lancer has recalled that for all the high-tech terrors of the Eastern Front, the T-34 tanks, the Sturmovik attack planes, the Katyusha rockets with their eldritch scream, nothing was worse than the deep-throated "Hurrah, hurrah!" accompanying the charge of the Red Army's infantry. The armored force, prime target on all of Barbarossa's fronts, was eviscerated in a matter of weeks. On July 15, 1941, the Elephantine Mechanized Corps were disbanded. The signature unit became the Tank Brigade, initially around 2,000 men and 93 tanks, two-thirds of them light T-60 tanks, whose 20mm pop guns and thin armor made them meat on the table for the panzers. Even that low strength proved materially unsustainable and beyond the capacity of most commanders. In December, the brigade was cut back to 800 men and 46 tanks, about the strength of a Western battalion. These small formations made predictably little headway in the winter counterattacks. In March 1942, the first 4 tank corps were authorized. Between April and September 1942, 25 more joined the order of battle. Their final configuration on paper was 3 tank brigades and a motorized rifle brigade, just short of 10,000 men and 165 tanks. A third of those tanks were T-60s. Their more complex stablemates, the medium T-34s that became the Red Army's signature armored vehicle, were still entering mass production. The 1942 order of battle remained the standard tank corps framework for the rest of the war. Light tanks were replaced by T-34s in a structure that was armor-heavy by developing Western standards, lacking both artillery to deal with German infantry and anti-tank guns and infantry to hold the ground it might gain. The former shortcoming would eventually be modified by increasing the number of turretless assault guns, the latter by creating mechanized corps built around truck-borne infantry. But the tank corps' structure was a function of its mission, exploiting the breakthroughs made by infantry and artillery-heavy shock forces as described before the war. That mission was easier defined than accomplished. The new tank corps underwent their first serious test in the Soviet Kharkov offensive in May 1942. Over 1,300 armored vehicles were concentrated for the attack. Early successes gained by mass could not be sustained against a flexible German defense built around coordinated air and armor strikes. The tank corps lagged too far behind the fighting lines to intervene quickly, then kept going as a German counterattack closed off the neck of the salient they formed. A similar, albeit smaller scale, armored debacle took place in the Crimea, where a single understrength panzer division took the measure of superior forces employed piecemeal. As Russian survivors fought delaying actions on the long retreat to the Don River, Russian staffs emphasized surprise, exploitation, and improved logistic support for future offensives. All of these appeared in the Stalingrad offensive. The rally and the counterattack orchestrated by Manstein showed that the Germans still mastered the armored battlefield. Mastered, but no longer dominated. Beginning with the new year, frontline commanders were reporting unpleasant tactical surprises. Red Army was no longer following its familiar pattern of engaging German strongpoints and exposing itself to paralyzing local riposts by the panzers. Instead, the tankers were bypassing the tanks, driving past them deep into the German rear. Lower unit leadership was becoming more flexible, more situationally oriented. 400,000 tankers were trained during the war. More than 300,000 died in battle, a ratio matching the often cited losses of the Nazi U-boat service, but in numbers 10 times greater. The execution squads of the security police, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or NKVD, were seldom to be found riding with the tankers. And the fatalism characteristic of the Red Army for almost a decade was beginning to develop among the tank crews into a determination, still unfocused but increasingly powerful, to take as many Hitlerites as possible along with them. The armored force attracted quality recruits, country boys who had dreamed of driving tractors with machinery collected, factory workers attracted by the technical and mechanical aspects, socialist modernization on treads. Russia's military heritage included elements other than brute force. It had a raiding culture as well, a concept of freewheeling mobility dating back to the Cossacks of the Zaporozhian Sich, the flying columns that devastated Napoleon's army during its retreat from Moscow, the mounted buccaneers of Semyon Budenny's Konarmia, cavalry army, during the Russian Civil War. Given the right catalyst, a Red Army tank corps was a potentially lethal compound. The Red Army was also developing a supporting infrastructure, most significantly in its artillery. Guns had been important to the Russian army since the 18th century. Stalin would call artillery the Red God of War. And here, anywhere, mass was dominant. Western armies emphasized fire mobility. The Soviets emphasized speed. The Red Army lacked the electronics and the technicians the Western style approach. Decentralization was not a part of Soviet principle or practice. Guns, on the other hand, were easier to manufacture than tanks, and heavy mortars were simpler than conventional artillery pieces. By October 1943, there were enough of them that Stavka authorized 26 artillery divisions, each with over 200 guns and howitzers, plus 108 heavy 120mm mortars. At the same time, 4 rocket launcher divisions were created. By the end of 1943, there were 7, each able to fire a salvo of over 3,400 rockets. The effect was an ability to saturate a battle zone in the fashion attempted by the Allies on the Western Front in 1916 to 1917. It was as sophisticated as a baseball bat to the kidneys, and just as effective. Even when the guns were deployed in forward exposed positions, German counter-battery fire and airstrikes, when these were available, were simply absorbed by the sheer number of targets. Artillery commanders were responsible to artillery superiors, creating a chain of command and control that enabled artillery to be used independently without particular and changeable commitments to the infantry and armor. The potential of the extended system was only marginally apparent during the Stalingrad campaign. At best, it had its limits. Against stationary targets or massed formations, it could have effects prefiguring those later projected with a nuclear bomb. The best counters were dispersion, mobility, flexibility. At first, the Germans would deny themselves all three, and Soviet gunners would make them pay. For the men in the Red Army's ranks, the war's second summer seemed to offer neither victory nor hope. Another third of 1,000,000 men, another 2,000 tanks had been lost. The survivors were caught up in what seemed an endless retreat across the steppes, broken by last stands on temporary stop lines. Sergei Bondarchuk, himself a veteran of 4 years wartime service, presented a sanitized dramatization in his 1975 epic film, They Fought for Their Country. He follows the remnants of a shattered rifle regiment as they make their way toward the Don of Stalingrad, facing the scorn of the civilians they abandoned, and wondering why their efforts so far have been so futile, until finally they turn to fight, unfurling their banner and following to glory on the Volga. The film's tone of determined optimism, interspersed with bits of comedy and nostalgia, parallels that of its Western counterparts of the 1940s and 1950s, in that it reflects an official policy that endured virtually until the Soviet Union's final implosion. Russia's soldiers and Russia's people behaved heroically. Should they not, in fact, live up to the trope, that was why the police system existed, and from privates to generals, all went in fear of the NKVD. Its presence was ubiquitous, but its behavior remained rampant until July 28, when Stalin issued Order No. 227, for an end to retreat, and demanded that every foot of Soviet soil be defended. These ranged from service in a penal battalion to summary execution. More than 150,000 Red Army soldiers were sentenced to death. The number of summary executions will never be known. High morale was a soldier's duty, not his right. But Stavka did not base morale on executions alone. Part of the mythology of Soviet recovery from Barbarossa involves Stalin's willingness to call on religion and nationalism. Orthodox prelates met with Stalin himself. Churches were opened, seminaries authorized. Accompanying this was a near cultic emphasis on the motherland, its heroes and its symbols. Motherland became a form of sacred space, combining emotional abstraction with geographic reality. Films and lectures celebrated legendary generals such as Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov, and Stalin, revolutionary defender of the city that now bore his name. Uniforms were smartened up with shoulder boards and standing collars. Military bling returned to fashion, a structure of medals, orders, and decorations that could literally cover the entire chest of senior officers such as Zhukov and his counterpart and rival, Ivan Konev. Enlisted men from cooks to snipers had their own badges recognizing distinguished service. As early as September 1941, the title of Guards was reintroduced. Not Red Guards, as might have been expected, just Guards, referring both to the revolutionary formations and to the elite troops of the Tsarist Empire. Units from independent battalions to entire armies that distinguished themselves in combat were rechristened and renumbered. Members of the units were titled Guardsmen, and the honorific accompanied them if they were transferred. The new spectrum of recognitions was welcome enough, but for the surviving veterans of 1941, for the wartime conscripts, and for the recovered wounded returning in increasing numbers, the sting of defeat was beginning to mask the cultures of buck-passing and scapegoating developed under 2 decades of post-revolutionary terror. The material and human devastation left in the Nazis' wake had become general knowledge. For some in the ranks, it generated anger at losing the results of generations of sacrifice and deprivation. The impulse to spiral into nihilism was counterbalanced by a growing conviction, even among the cynical and disaffected, that nothing was wrong with the Soviet Union that the Germans could fix, or wanted to. A comprehensive and enduring propaganda campaign to encourage and systematize hate, to make killing Germans a pleasure and a habit. Training, never exactly a humanitarian enterprise in the Red Army, inculcated toughness by such exercises as having tanks drive over recruits in trenches, sometimes they dug themselves. An accident was a sovereign cure for reluctance to dig deep. A common Red Army type never developed even in the homogenized context of total war, and despite an official Soviet policy expressing the collective nature of its sacrifice and victory. Age and ethnicity, background and culture sustained individual identities. Confidence and comradeship, hope of recognition and fear of punishment, ideology and tradition all played roles in renewing and refocusing combat motivation. Underpinning them all, even at the war's middle stage, was the frontline soldiers' increasing hope that their sacrifices would bring about post-war reform, communism with a human face, purged of pre-war hatreds and misunderstandings, productive capacity adjusted to civilian needs and wants, leaders and people committed to the same goal. Boris Gorbachev, by then a captain, recalls a pre-war discussion with half a dozen men around a kind of campfire that inspired swapping confidences even when monks were present. If only the authorities would give us freedom, spare us from Polko's troubles, and think up something like the NEP. If only they'd set us free, we could rebuild all of Russia within 5 years. Illusion and delusion were not Third Reich monopolies. The Red Army's background is best understood in the context of disconnects between the party and the military and among the major combat arms. The German Army of 1943 is best understood in terms of synergies among army, party, and society, and within the Army's fighting components. The Nazi Party has been compared by scholars with almost every possible human organization, even medieval feudalism. The one adjective that cannot be applied is patriarchal. Change and progress were the movement's flywheels. Nazi nostalgia found its essential expression in domestic kitsch. It had no place in military matters. Hitler's initially enthusiastic wooing of the soldiers was based on his intention of using them first to consolidate his hold over both the Nazi Party and the German people, then as the standard-bearers of territorial and ideological expansion until they could safely be replaced by the SS. National Socialist views of war differed in important, arguably essential respects from those of the Reichswehr, but on such subjects as anti-Marxism, anti-pacifism, and hostility to the Versailles Treaty, the military's values were not incongruent with those avowed by Nazi theorists and propagandists. The armed forces and the Nazis also shared a common commitment to the future rather than a vision of the past. General Hans von Seeckt, during the Great War, had established a reputation as one of the Army's most brilliant staff officers.
Yes.
He became head of the Reichswehr High Command in the newly established Weimar Republic. From the beginning, he challenged the concept of mass that had permeated military thinking since the Napoleonic Wars, instead insisting on the principle of pursuing quick, decisive victories by offensive action. Boldness was Seeckt's first rule, flexibility was his second. The Treaty of Versailles, however, specified the structure of the Reichswehr in detail, a force of 100,000, but forbidden tanks, aircraft, and medium or heavy artillery, it badly needed force multipliers. Versailles did authorize each Reichswehr division a motor transport battalion, and Seeckt saw their vehicles as an increasingly valuable supplement to the conventional combat arms. Beginning in the early 1930s, war games focused on not merely the combination, but the integration of mobility and striking power, quality enhanced by technology. In 1934, the first experimental armored division was authorized. The next year, Hitler reintroduced conscription and officially initiated rearmament. In return, the armed forces gave the Nazis a free hand in Germany's reconstructuring. This decision reflected neither simple-mindedness nor moral blindness. The Reichswehr understood, better than any army in the world, that total war and industrial war had generated new styles of combat and new methods of leadership. The officer no longer stood above his unit, but functioned as an integral part of it. The patriarchal hegemonic approach of the old Prussian German army, parenting youthful conscripts and initiating them into adult society, was giving way to a collegial affective pattern, emphasizing cooperation and consensus in mission performance. Mass man must give way to extraordinary man. the combination of fighter and technician who understood combat as both a skilled craft and an inner experience. The soldiers were confident that once Germany's young men changed their brown shirts and Hitler Youth uniforms for Army field gray, their socialization away from National Socialism would be relatively easy. The Army knew well how to cultivate them from its own resources. The new Wehrmacht had new facilities. Leave policies were generous. Food was well cooked and ample. Uniforms looked smart and actually fit. No small matters to young men on pass seeking to make quick impressions. The conscripts were motivated, alert, and physically fit. Thanks to the 18 months of compulsory labor service required of all 17-year-olds since 1935, they required a minimum of socializing into barracks life and were more than casually acquainted with the elements of close-order drill. Officers and non-commissioned officers were expected to bond with their men, leading by example on a daily basis. The Army was still the Army, and NCOs had lost none of their historic set of tools, official and unofficial, to motivate recalcitrants and make them examples for the rest. But military service had for over a century been a major rite of passage for males in Prussia, Germany. The Army's demands had generally been understood as not beyond the capacities of an ordinarily fit, well-adjusted young man. That military service had been restricted during the Weimar years gave it a certain forbidden appeal, and a near-standard response of older generations across the Republic's social and political spectrum to anything smacking of late adolescent malaise or rebellion was that what the little punks needed was some shaping up in uniform. Recruit processing differed significantly from both pre-1914 practice and the patterns in contemporary conscript armies. While not ignoring experience, aptitude, education, and even social class, the German sorting and screening system paid close attention to what later generations would call personality profiles. Determination, presence of mind, and situational awareness were the qualities most valued. Initial training in all branches can best be compared to a combination of the U.S. Army's basic training with its advanced infantry training, informed by the Marine Corps' mantra of "every man a rifleman." That reflected the belief that infantry warfare's moral and physical demands were the greatest. A soldier who could not meet them was less than an effective soldier, no matter his level of technical proficiency. Misunderstandings and mistakes in combat were to be expected. Overcoming them depended more on character than intellect, and character in the context of combat meant, above all, will. The question of nature versus nurture did not significantly engage the Wehrmacht. Long before Leni Riefenstahl celebrated Hitler's version of the concept, the armed forces acted on the principle that a soldier's will was essentially a product of cultivation. Drill was the means to develop the reflexive coordination of mind and body. Troops trained day or night, at immediate notice, in all weather, under conditions including no rations. Combat conditions were simulated through the extensive use of live ammunition. Casualties were necessary reminders of the dangers of carelessness and stupidity. A persistent mythology continues to depict the German Army of World War II as a clean shield force, fighting first successfully and then heroically against heavy odds, simultaneously doing its best to avoid contamination by National Socialism, a band of brothers united by an unbreakable comradeship. That concept of comradeship is arguably the strongest emotional taproot of what John Mearsheimer has memorably dubbed Wehrmacht. Soldiers and scholars inside and outside Germany have consistently cited comradeship to explain the fighting power the Reich's opponents found so impressive. Particularly in the context of the Russian front, the concept of comradeship has been described as an increasingly artificial construction based on Nazi ideology generated by material demodernization and consistent high casualty rates that destroyed primary groups and depended on long-standing relationships. Small relational groups based on affinity, proximity, and experience were above all survival mechanisms. A man physically or emotionally alone in Russia was a casualty waiting to happen. The ad hoc, constantly renewed and reconstructed communities resulting from heavy losses were held together by the old hands, sometimes of no more than a few days standing, who set the tone and sustained the newcomers, not only seeking but needing to belong in order to survive physically and mentally. Good was in fact frequently defined as any behavior that strengthened the fragile, fungible, ad hoc community against external or internal challenges. But however deep ran their brutalization, the ground forces, Army and Waffen-SS alike, never degenerated collectively into what Martin van Creveld called the Wild Horde. Lawless and disorganized, committed to destruction for destruction's sake, self-referencing to the point of solipsism, the Horde can neither give nor inspire the trust necessary for the kind of fighting power the Germans demonstrated to the end. Comradeship helped them to remain soldiers, not warriors or killers. And after 1945, for German veterans, comradeship became the war's central justifying experience. Few were willing to admit they had fought for Hitler and his right. The concept of defending home and loved ones was balanced, and increasingly overbalanced, by overwhelming evidence that the war had been Germany's war from start to finish. What remained were half-processed memories nurtured over an evening glass of tea or an occasional regimental reunion, memories of mutual caring, mutual commitment, and sacrifice for others. Traditionally considered to be feminine virtues, these human aspects of comradeship made it possible to come to terms morally and emotionally with war's inhuman face, and to come to terms with the nature of the regime one's sacrifices had sustained. If the Soviets saw war as a science, the Germans interpreted it as an art. Though requiring basic craft skills, war defied reduction to rules and principles. Its mastery demanded study and reflection, but depended ultimately on two virtually untranslatable concepts, Fingerspitzengefühl and Tuchfühlung. The closest English equivalent is the more sterile phrase situational awareness. The German concept incorporated as well the sense of panache, the difference, in horseman's language, between a hunter and a hack, or in contemporary terms, the difference between a family sedan and a muscle car. It emphasized speed and daring, maneuvering as hard a blow as possible from a direction as unexpected as possible. The mobile way of war was epitomized in the panzer divisions. From its inception, the division was conceptualized as a balanced, combined arms force. Tanks and motorized infantry, motorcyclists and armored cars, artillery, engineers, and signals would train and fight together at a pace set by the army. The Panzer Division would break into an enemy position, break through, and break out with its own resources, thereby solving the fundamental German problem of World War I. But the Panzer Division could also create opportunities on an enemy flank or in his rear areas. It could conduct pursuit and turn pursuit into exploitation. It could discover opportunities with its reconnaissance elements, capture objectives with its tanks, hold them with its infantry, then regroup and repeat the performance 100 miles away. No less significant was the rapid development of radio and the accompanying sense that commanders of mobile forces could and must be at the head of their units. Helmut von Moltke the Elder's familiar aphorism that no plan survives contact with the enemy acquired a new context. In the future, mechanized commanders and mechanized forces would be able to make, remake, and implement plans immediately reflecting changing situations. War by timetable, in the fashion of 1914 to 1918, would become war by stopwatch. The critique of mass war developed in German military thought after 1918 had never excluded numbers per se. Its goal had been the eventual creation of a force able to achieve decisive tactical and operational results initially, thus avoiding the spiral of escalation forcing Germany into a war of attrition, exactly the kind of war the professional soldiers had warned for decades that Germany had no chance of winning. The army that took the field, however, was the product of improvisation. The steady pace originally projected by the General Staff and the High Command was submerged by a rearmament that rapidly became its own justification and increasingly outran available human and material resources. Even after the blood purge of 1934 eliminated the possibility of using the Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary brown shirts, as the basis for an effective military system, the army continued to fear dual loyalty in an increasingly Nazified society. Total war, of the kind Hitler seemed willing not merely to risk, but to affirm, remained in strategic terms the wrong kind of war for Germany. And in social-political contexts, a mass war involving the German folk was likely to benefit the Nazis far more than the soldiers. Since the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussian-German army had stressed the desirability of a high average. The general staff developed as a leaven to the officer corps as a whole, rather than as a self-absorbed elite. In operational terms, one regiment, division, or corps had been considered as capable as any other. When reserve divisions were organized on a large scale as part of the run-up to World War I, they were structured as far as possible to the active army's norms, and from the beginning used in the same way as active formations. In 1939, however, most of the divisions were formed by waves, Wellen, each with differing scales of equipment, levels of training, and operational effectiveness. Now, in planning for war, the Army had developed a hierarchy of dependability, with the peacetime divisions of the first wave at its apex, and the mobile divisions at the apex of the first wave. That situation offered the Army a political and military window of opportunity. The tactical, doctrinal, and institutional concepts developed by the Reichswehr and refined after 1933 provided the prospect of decisive offensive operations executed not by a small professional army, but by specialized technocratic formations within the mass. High-tech force multipliers favored developing an elite, not in the racial ideological sense, but a functional elite based on learned skills. Its professionalism would enable the employment of ways of war, inapplicable by homogenized mass armies in the pattern of 1914 to 1918, that would produce victories. Soldiers and academics alike in recent years have been at pains to discredit and deconstruct the concept of blitzkrieg. Reduced to its essentials, the critique is that the German victories of 1939 to 1941 were not consequences of doctrine or planning. They developed from a series of accidents and coincidences reflecting improvisations born of the necessity to avoid a war of attrition and responding to imperatives generated by the random nature of the National Socialist regime. Blitzkrieg was not a comprehensive principle for mobilizing and employing Germany's resources, nor was it a structure of concepts expressed in manuals, taught in schools, and practiced in maneuvers. To say that Blitzkrieg was an ex post facto construction nevertheless makes as much sense as to assemble the components of a watch, shake the pieces in a sack, and expect to pull out a functioning timepiece. Blitzkrieg was the latest manifestation of mobile war, the historic focus of Prussian-German military planning that Seyss' contemporaries sought to restore after 1918. Blitzkrieg also gave a technologically based literalness to an abstract concept. Mobile war waged with human and animal muscle power had always been more of an intellectual construct than a physical reality. In Blitzkrieg, the combination of radios and engines made it possible for an army literally to run rings around its enemy, if, and it was a big if, its moral and intellectual qualities were on the par with its material. Between 1939 and 1941, that was the case, from France and Belgium to Yugoslavia and Cyrenaica. The stresses of making war in Russia, however, transmuted Blitzkrieg's strengths to its weaknesses. Production lagged behind expenditures. Casualties exceeded replacement capacities. The gap in capabilities and effectiveness between the mechanized elite and foot-marching horse-drawn infantry divisions grew into a chasm. One consequence was the progressive evolution of the mechanized forces from spearhead to backbone, the necessary element of every operation from holding the front in the winter of 1941 to leading the way street by street in Stalingrad a year later. Infantry divisions remained so chronically ineffective that by 1943 they were in the process of being reduced to 6 battalions instead of the original 9. New weapons, like the MG-42 light machine gun and hammered man portable tank rockets, enhanced the infantry's firepower. but the reconfigured divisions lacked the staying power to sustain operations, offensive defense against a Red Army increasingly able to depend on more than its own determination. As the panzers became more than elite, their responsibilities expanded beyond any original intentions. The mobile divisions were increasingly expected to use their own resources to hold ground, recover it, and secure it, at the expense of generating and sustaining offensive momentum. By the end of the winter fighting in 1942, the 18 panzer divisions on the Russian front had a combined strength of only around 600 serviceable tanks. The shortages of trucks and other supporting vehicles were greater. Replacing casualties and equipment was a haphazard process, almost random, depending on which division could be pulled off the line, how far back it could be moved, and what was available in the detailed workforce. A second consequence was tunnel vision, a focus on hitting the next target, an emphasis on action at the expense of reflection at all levels and in all aspects of war-making. Prussian-German military planning historically tended to devolve downward, privileging operational art at the expense of strategic objectives, and privileging tactical virtuosity at the expense of both. A chronic shortage of staff officers at all levels, often uncritically praised as reflecting a lean profile, in practice too often meant chronic overwork and no time to think about next week. Improvisation was a necessity in the way of mobile forces. But improvisation on the Eastern Front too often tended to the verge of randomness and beyond. Third, and arguably most serious in the long run, was a culture, a mentality that had developed into something combining convenience and indifference, embedded in the matrix of hardness. Hardness was neither cruelty nor fanaticism. It is best understood as evolving from pre-war concepts as will focused by intelligence for the purpose of accomplishing a mission. It was a mindset particularly enabled the brutal expediency that is an enduring aspect of war, and was underwritten and nurtured by Nazi ideology. Hardness transmuted expediency into a norm and redefined as a virtue. Impersonalization and depersonalization went hand in hand. Interfering civilians or inconvenient POWs might not be designedly and routinely disposed of, but they could be, with fewer and fewer questions asked externally or internally. The culture of hardness was centered in the Army's junior officers. With the outbreak of war, combat experience became the dominant criterion for a commission. By the end of 1942, any German over 16 could become an Army officer if he served acceptably at the front, demonstrated the proper character, believed in the Nazi cause, and was pure. And the final three criteria were as much a matter of square filling as rigorous investigation. This relative democratization in good part reflected the growing synergy between National Socialist ideology and the demands of the front. Hitler wanted young men as tough as leather, as sweet as greyhounds, and as hard as tough steel, correspondingly unburdened by reflection or imagination. The Red Army at its best did not offer sophisticated tactical opposition. What regiment and division commanders wanted in subordinates was tough men, physically and mentally, willing to lead from the front and publicly confident in even the most desperate situations. One might speculate, indeed, that a steady supply of 20-something lieutenants with blue badges and attitudes helped older, wiser, and more tired superiors to suppress any intelligent doubts about Hitler and his movement. Chapter 2. Preparation. The battle's first developed in the wider context of the war that the last leadership from Hitler downward understood something of ours. In the aftermath of Al-Alamein, Hitler had heavily reinforced defeat in South Africa. The result was a few tactical victories, won against inexperienced troops, that proved operationally barren and strategically weak. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was worn down physically. He halted one attack when the American artillerymen facing it had a 15 minutes of ammunition. He managed to concentrate 3 panzer divisions for an attack against the British Army advancing the largest armored attack the Germans made in the entire campaign. But radio success gave Field Marshal Marshal Bernard von and outlined his enemy's intentions, with the result that the Germans went into a multi-layered, prepared defense that blew the heart out of the Panthers. The Marshal has made a bold of it, Montgomery finally observed, and within minutes, Rommel called off a battle that by all odds is his most embarrassing. 3 weeks later, on March 26, 1943, the British 8th Army enveloped the Marne Front. On April 19th, there was the First Army in the U.S. Second Corps attacked to the west. Despite Hitler's continued reinforcing of failure, there would be no chance of the final outcome. Hopes for the U-boat and faith in new weapons, nerve gas, super long-range cannon to rocket bombs, were balanced against narrow, round-the-clock aerial offensive, using increasing amounts of the Reich's high-tech capacities. They were further dimmed by the prospects of a cross-channel invasion sometime in 1943 by an alliance demonstrating in North Africa an uncomfortably high level, albeit on a small scale. The domestic situation was no less disquieting. In 1942, the Eastern Front alone had cost the Army an average of more than 100,000 deaths each month. Not counting the completely unfit and the indispensable war workers, over March 1943, the Reich was down to its last 500,000 bodies. In 1942, the Eastern Front had also cost 5,500 tanks, 8,000 guns, almost 250,000 vehicles. 2/3 of the 20,000 written-off aircraft had been lost in Russia. These material losses were being successfully replaced, but for how long? Hitler's fundamental distrust of both the German people and his own apparatus of repression and control. He believed firmly that Germany had been stabbed in the back by the collapse of its home front in 1918. Total mobilization, as practiced in Russia and Great Britain, restricting women to war work, shutting down civilian rights, combing the economy ruthlessly for men, was highly risky and to a great extent beyond the capacities of a hapless, inefficient Nazi system. Paradoxically, from Hitler's perspective, the strategic situation seemed promising on the Russian front. Post-war historians followed the general memoirs in blaming the defeat curse on the Führer. Hitler is indicted, tried, and convicted, first for refusing to accept the professionals' recommendations and shift to an operational offensive, replacing the losses of the winter campaign and temporarily trading space for time while allowing the Red Army to extend itself in a new offensive. Then for using the refitted mobile divisions in counterattacks, such as Manstein's post-Stalingrad backhands. Once having forced through the concept of an offensive, Hitler is described as first firing it while the Russians reinforced the sector, then abandoning it when, against the odds, the generals and the Lancer were on the point of once more pulling the Reich's chestnuts from the fire. Reality, as might be expected, is a good deal more complex. As early as October 1941, Japan had offered to act as an intermediary in negotiating a Russo-German peace in the interest of focusing the Axis against Britain and the United States. Even before the Soviet offensive at Stalingrad, Hitler had rejected Italian suggestions for either seeking terms with Russia or shutting down the Eastern Front and transferring resources to an increasingly threatened Western theater. Hitler rejected both possibilities repeatedly and emphatically. For the Führer, the Reich's blood-bought living space was not a negotiable asset. Defeat and retreat, moreover, meant material losses were permanent, while in an offensive, damaged weapons and vehicles could often be repaired by a maintenance system whose efficiency is improved by necessity. Hitler's specific insistence that South Russia's resources were too significant for sustaining Germany's war effort to be casually fought over, much less abandoned, could not be simply dismissed. Neither could his argument that the slightest hint of negotiations between Germany and the USSR would only encourage the Anglo-Americans to intensify their air offensive and step up their invasion plans. Instead, with the turn of the year, Hitler increasingly focused his strategic thinking on the east. Italy and Hungary were withdrawing their forces from Russia. Romania was reducing its commitment. Finland had always fought a parallel war. A major victory was badly needed to impress these Western allies. Russia offered the best immediate prospect of such a victory that might convince even Turkey to join the war, and prospects for negotiations with Stalin, which seemed more likely than discussing peace with Winston Churchill, was better undertaken from a position of strength than one of stalemate. Perhaps as early as the coming autumn, when weather again closed down the front, something might be undertaken in that quarter. By any rational calculation, the Reich's short-term prospects of total victory were close to zero. Without Hitler's iron determination, Germany would probably have been ready to conclude peace in 1943. But by that time, the National Socialist Führer state had so far eroded the principal institutions of government, party, Wehrmacht, and society that neither institutional nor personal forums for debating the issue in any consequent way existed. Not only was no one but Hitler responsible for the whole, no one, above all no one in the military, was willing to risk looking beyond operational factors, considering the larger strategic issues, and concluding that the war might be unwinnable, much less acting on such a conclusion. Like many another Third Reich design, the Kursk offensive would take on a half-life of its own. In the spring of 1943, the Army High Command, the OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, responsible for the war in Russia, was divided evenly on the specific issue of attack and defense on the Eastern Front. Heinz Guderian was one of the many generals supplanted during the Ablussungswinter, relief winter of 1941 to 1942. In February 1943, he was restored to power and favor as the newly created Inspector General of Armored Troops. From his first weeks in office, he argued against any major offensive during 1943 in favor of rebuilding a mechanized force that had been limits by the fighting at the turn of the year. Wait until 1944, Guderian urged. Build a mobile reserve strong enough to hold any weapons the British and Americans show them. Strike in the east with divisions built around a new generation of heavy tanks, with increased numbers of half-tracks, assault guns, and self-propelled artillery pieces. Manstein, by this time the doyen and guru of the Russian front, at least in his own mind, believed Guderian took too little account of the Red Army's growing size and effectiveness. Manstein's answer was a lasting defense, giving ground before a Soviet offensive, then striking the flanks. This, he believed, would maximize German officers' mastery of mobile warfare and German soldiers' fighting power. However, the concept was Manstein's personal brainchild, barely articulated, tested over no more than a few months, and for practical purposes unfamiliar even in the Panzer Corps. Nor was elastic defense a panacea. Its success depended on an obliging enemy, making the right mistakes at the right time. The Red Army of 1943 was less and less obliging. Manstein made his case to the Army's Chief of Staff, Kurt Zeitzler, on March 7, 1943. Zeitzler had held the post since September 1942, replacing the dismissed Franz Halder. Although no lapdog, he had deliberately sought closer contact with this in order to improve the eroding relationships among policy, planning, and command. Also, like many interwar trained staff officers, he was more in the model of a troop staff officer than a traditional general staff. It is an overlooked irony that the often criticized Versailles, by abolishing the general staff in its historic form, may have contributed significantly to the tunnel vision so characteristic of the German High Command. Certainly, Zeitzler was more concerned with resting the mobile troops than with long-term strategic planning. Manstein responded by explaining that he could not defend a 450-mile front with 25 divisions. It was either sustain the initiative and attack, or be forced back again, sacrificing new material and moral gains made since Stalingrad's surrender. Manstein had a chance to make his case in person when Hitler visited his headquarters on March 10th. On one level, it was propaganda theater, with 16 senior generals present as a chorus line to celebrate the latest achievements of the greatest warlord of all time. The Führer was in a correspondingly mellow mood and listened when Manstein reiterated the importance of resuming mobile operations. Another backhand, frustrating and then rolling back the Soviet attack, was a possibility. A better option was a forehand stroke to eliminate what Manstein called the first balcony. Elastic defense was for Manstein a temporary expedient to wear down Soviet forces and prepare for a grander design. The backhand solution promised the greatest results. But what if the Soviets did not cooperate by attacking? Or if the Red Army chose a different sector, not graced with Manstein's presence? What if the British and Americans were somehow inspired to seize the operational initiative in the West and deplete the reserves Manstein considered necessary for an effective backhand storm? Manstein's compromise concept was a combined general offensive by his Army Group South and Army Group Center against the Kursk salient. A large-scale double penetration would not only cut off Soviet forces in the salient, but draw Soviet reserves in the entire region onto a German anvil in the fashion of 1941. With the Russians significantly weakened, and with the front shortened by 150 miles, German reserves could more readily be deployed for further operations against the Soviet flanks and rear. The long-range prospects of such operations were above the Field Marshal's pay grade, or perhaps his professional horizons. What he did insist on was that something must be done quickly, before Soviet material power grew overwhelming, and while the Germans could take advantage of the dry season, and before the Western Allies could establish themselves on the continent. Hitler's distrust of his generals had in no way lessened. He made no secret of his belief that they deceived him at every opportunity. But on March 13th, he issued Operations Order No. 5. It called for a spring offensive to regain the initiative, but its objectives remained vague. Manstein repeatedly informed Zeitzler that Kursk was within the Germans' immediate grasp. Clearing the salient, however, would require the participation of Army Group Center. It was correspondingly disconcerting when Gunther von Kluge's Army Group Center replied that it lacked the strength to participate in the kind of assault Manstein projected. That refusal made Manstein's commitment to the Kursk operation even firmer. It was a high-risk window of opportunity that must be seized, even with limited resources. Adolf Hitler once described his field marshal's horizons as the size of a toilet seat. Manstein's version of that plumbing item, however, seems to have been too large for the Führer's comfort. On March 21st, Hitler took Kursk off the table. Was he concerned for the still continuing muddy season, the Rasputitsa which bogged down tanks and trucks? Was he anxious about the steadily mounting, as yet unreplaced losses of men and equipment? Did he worry about securing the gains of Manstein's previous offensive? Perhaps he feared nurturing an overmighty subject by sustaining his freedom to act. Guderian noted at the time Hitler's inability to tolerate the presence of so capable and soldierly a person as Manstein in his environment. The question became temporarily moot when Manstein's eye problems compelled him to return to Germany for treatment on March 30th. He kept in touch with his headquarters, but recovery absorbed his energy. The 57-year-old Manstein had pushed himself hard since 1940, and minor surgery, in this case sick leave for treatment of a developing cataract, kept him away. Manstein's absence cleared Zeitzler's field. He was also attracted by the prospects of eliminating the Kursk salient, albeit for less ambitious reasons than those of his subordinate. He considered weakening the Russians in the southern sector and shortening the front quite enough to be going on with, particularly given the increasing Russian concentration in and on the salient. On April 11th, he submitted a recommendation to Hitler. It called for a peace attempt, utilizing a reinforced army from the north and from the south. They would meet at Kursk. The hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners would be sent to Germany as slave labor in the overextended war industry. With the shortened Eastern Front line, Germany could reinforce the Western theater against the inevitable invasion and free reserves for further operations in Russia. A dozen or so panzer divisions, the Chief of Staff suggested, should be enough to complete the job. On April 15th, Hitler responded. The opening paragraph of Operations Order No. 6 spoke of decisive significance, a signal to all the world. The attacking forces were to be concentrated on the narrowest possible front and break through the enemy at one blow. The earliest date for the attack was set at May 6th. The code name was Operation Significance. In sharp contrast with the far-reaching objectives set in 1941 and 1942, Citadel's operational geography was so limited that it required a small-scale regional map to follow. Order number 6 insisted on the sovereign importance of maintaining surprise through camouflage, deception, and disinformation. Success depended even more on preventing reserve siphoning Soviet breakthroughs elsewhere. Army groups south and center must prepare as well for defensive battles on the remainder of their respective fronts. All means must be used to make all sectors secure. But recognizing that the shining times of 1940 to 1941 were past did not make Kursk a limited offensive. Success offered a chance to damage the Red Army sufficiently to at least stabilize the Eastern Front and perhaps even develop a temporary political solution to a militarily unwinnable war. In principle and in reality, the offensive was promising. Strategically, even a limited victory would remove a major threat to German flanks in the sector and limit prospects for a Red Army breakout toward the Dnieper. Barbarossa and Blue, the Germans won their victories at the start of campaigns and ran down as the wars were extended. Citadel's relatively modest objectives seemed insured against that risk. This time, forward units would not be ranging far beyond the front, to nowhere in particular. There were no economic temptations like those the Ukraine offered in 1941 or the Caucasus in 1942. Kursk would be a straightforward soldiers' battle. As for what would happen next, sufficient unto the day and the evil thereof. It was a line of thinking, perhaps a line of feeling, uncomfortably reminiscent of Erich Ludendorff's approach to the great events of March 1918. Punch a hole and see what happens. In its immediate context, this nevertheless seemed eminently plausible, the kind of prepared offensive that had frustrated the Soviets from divisional to theater levels for 18 months. Geographically, the sector was small enough to enable concentrated overstretched Luftwaffe assets on scales unseen since 1941. Logistically, the objectives were well within reach. Operationally, the double envelopment of the salient was a textbook exercise. Tactically, from company to corps, the panzer commanders were skilled and confident. Materially, for the first time since Barbarossa, they would have tanks to match Soviet quality. That last point called for explanation, particularly since thirst and armor are symbiotically linked in most accounts of World War II. German armor doctrine stressed avoiding tank-on-tank encounters. German tank designs emphasized mobility and reliability as opposed to protection and firepower. From Poland to North Africa, the system worked. In Russia, it faltered, not least because of the growing presence of the Soviet T-34 tank, which could do anything its German counterparts could do, was better armored, and carried a powerful 76mm gun. Prior to Barbarossa, German tank crews and tank officers had been a significant, albeit intangible, force multiplier. But the technological discrepancy between the Mark III and IV Panzers and the T-34 diminished. In human terms, the German armored divisions were about as good as they were likely to get, given the limits of flesh, blood, intelligence, and character. In numerical terms, every calculation demonstrated inability to outproduce the Soviets. Technically, the Panzer III, backbone of the armored force through 1942, could be updone no further. That left three options. One involved taking advantage of the large turret ring and robust chassis of the Mark III's stablemate, the Mark IV, and upgrading what had been designed as a support vehicle to a main battle tank. Technically, the reconfiguration was highly successful. However, it was achieved at the expense of production numbers and repair statistics. The second possibility was copying the T-34, either conceptually or by reverse engineering. In the latter case, the Russian vehicle's cast turret and its aluminum engine would have challenged German capacity and resources. The two-man turret diminished the crew's effectiveness, still a German strong point. In any case, the lead times involved were an almost certain guarantee that when German indications reached the front, the Red Army would be another generation ahead. That left a new design, which became the Panther. Its design and pre-production absorbed most of 1942, and delivery projected by May 1943 was only 250. Its 75mm L-70 was the most ballistically effective tank gun of World War II.
What the hell's happening here?
But apart from the predictable teething troubles, two fundamental issues emerged.
What's happening here?
One was protection. Would the Panther's well-sloped frontal armor suffice against the weapons likely to be introduced as a counter? Its side armor, moreover, was not much better than that of its predecessors. The Panther's other problem was the engine. The tank weighed 45 tons. Its Maybach 230 delivered a power-to-weight ratio of 15.5 horsepower per ton, low enough to strain the entire drive system and make up-armoring problematic. Not perfect, but good enough, was the verdict rendered in the developing crisis of the Eastern Front. The Panther's counterpart, the Panzer VI, better known as the Tiger First, lent its all to the whole German armored force. Even experienced British and U.S. troops were likely to see Tigers behind every tank and leading every counterattack. There have been at least 100 books in English, French, and German devoted to the Tiger's origins and performance. The first Tiger was a birthday present for the Führer in April 1942. Its initial production runs were set modestly at 15 a month by September. The Russians were expected to be defeated by the time the new tanks could take the lead. The Tiger was all muscle, a slab-sided beast sophisticated as a knee in the groin. Incorporating components from several firms and several design projects, it was always high maintenance. That does not mean unreliable. Tiger was like a woman, in the words of one old man. If you treated her right, she'd treat you right. The Tiger was also not a cheap date. Range on a full tank was only 125 miles. Speed was on the low side of adequate by previous Panzer standards, about 20 miles per hour on roads, half that and less cross-country. But far from being a semi-mobile furniture van, Mobilwagen, Tiger was intended for offensive operations, exploitation as well as breakthrough. Its cross-country mobility was as good as that of most of its contemporaries, and with an 88mm gun behind more than 100mm of frontal armor, the Tiger could outshoot anything on any battlefield. Tested in small numbers from Leningrad to Tunisia beginning in August 1942, the Panzer VI seemed ideal for the conditions developing around Kursk, although it could be deployed only in small numbers, 128 at the start of Citadel. In one sense, that was Hitler's problem. The tank and the situation fit together too well for comfort. As early as April 18th, the Führer inquired whether a preferable alternative might be to do the really unexpected and attack the salient's relatively vulnerable nose. In 1914, with war only hours away, German Emperor Wilhelm II reacted to a vague hint of French neutrality by saying that now the whole army could be sent to the Eastern Front. His chief of staff never recovered from the shock. Kurt Zeitzler had a stronger nervous system. The time lost in shifting forces, he replied, would impose unacceptable delay, sacrifice prospects for surprise, and encourage a Soviet attack as the Germans redeployed. Hitler calmed down for a week. Then he received a disconcerting report from the commanding general of the army responsible for Citadel's northern half. Walter Model is best remembered as a tactician, a defensive specialist shoring up broken fronts in the Reich's final years. But he had made his bones with the Panzers, commanding a division and then a corps before being assigned to Army Group Center's right flank 9th Army in January 1942. He was also a trained staff officer, and the details of his army's proposed mission were not reassuring. The plan allowed too little time for preparation. It took too little account of the defense system the Soviets were constructing in Model's zone of attack. It allotted too few men and tanks to underwrite Model's original estimate of 2 days to achieve a breakthrough. As corroborating evidence mounted, 6 days seemed a more reasonable figure. Hitler respected this tough, profane battle captain enough to schedule a one-on-one meeting for April 27th. He rejected Model's suggestion that a preferable alternative was to shorten Army Group Center's line and await a Soviet attack. But he was impressed by the visual aids Model proffered, aerial photos showing a spider web of Soviet fortifications and trench lines matching anything in World War I. He responded by postponing the start of the offensive to May 5th, then to May 9th, and he spoke privately with Zeitzler about dropping it back to mid-June. the Führer took his concerns to a conference in Munich. The key meeting was on May 4th. The principal participants were Zeitzler, Manstein, Kluge, and Guderian, plus Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Jesenek. Hitler began by explaining in almost an hour's worth of detail his reasons for postponing the attack, essentially the same ones offered by the absent Model. When called on to reply, Manstein reiterated the necessity for an early success in the East, noting that by June, the Red Army's overall abilities to mount its own offensive would be significantly enhanced. Rather than lose time reinforcing the armor, Manstein asked for more infantry, at least 2 divisions, to facilitate breaking through the Red Army's defenses. Hitler responded that none were available. Tanks would have to compensate. Kluge was next, and he spoke out strongly against postponement. He described Model as exaggerating Russian strength and warned that Citadel's delay increased the risk of a major Soviet attack elsewhere on his army group's front. Hitler shut him down by replying that he, not Model, was the pessimist here. Guderian promptly asked permission to speak. He called the first operation pointless. It would cost armor losses the Reich could neither afford nor replace. And if the Panthers were expected to make a difference, they were still suffering from teething troubles and should not be counted on. Guderian concluded by recommending that should Citadel be allowed to proceed, the armor should be massed on one front to achieve total superiority. In other words, to create a decisive point, the Schwerpunkt that had been a feature of German planning for a century. Jesenek agreed, along with mentioning that the Luftwaffe had no chance of matching the Red Air Force's concentration and strength if the delays continued. By this time, Hitler had a well-developed approach to dealing with the senior officers he disliked and mistrusted. He structured conferences around his own remarkable memory for detail, bolstered by information provided directly by his staff. If he failed to carry a point by drowning it in statistics, he insisted that decisions were best made spontaneously. Instinct processed data more reliably than did calculation. Almost disconcertingly, neither of these behaviors was in particular evidence on May 4th. Instead, Hitler seemed to weigh events and balance prospects. The Axis position in Tunisia was collapsing with unexpected speed. Formal resistance ended on May 13th. For 10 days before that, increasing numbers of Germans and Italians were on their way to POW camps. The final tally was nearly 250,000, worse than Stalingrad, without even the possibility of spinning the catastrophe into a heroic last stand. Hitler obsessively saw himself as working against time. In contrast with Marxist-based radicalism, which ultimately understood itself to be on the side of history, Hitler's clock was always at 5 minutes to midnight. That in turn reflected Hitler's increasing sense of his own mortality, combined with the self-fulfilling paradox that Hitler's self-defined role had no place for a genuine successor. But his reflexive compulsion to action was in this case arguably balanced by Model's photographs. Hitler's identity was also shaped by his experiences as a Great War combat veteran, a Frontschwein, front hog, who understood battle in ways alien to the grand gentleman of general staff. And what he had seen, studied indeed with a magnifying glass, was all too reminiscent of a Western front that had ultimately defied German efforts at a breakthrough. Inaction was not an option, neither was a second failure. In the first half of May, Hitler's thoughts, and more important, his feelings, turned to the new tanks as he increasingly came to view technical superiority as the key to defeating enemies committed to mass force. Moreover, since 1940, the Panzers had been Germany's arm of precision, challenging and overcoming space, time, and numbers in every conceivable situation. This time they would do it again. The May 4th meeting did not result in a decision, but on May 5th, Citadel's date was reset to June 12th. When Guderian warned again that the Panthers could not be made combat ready for 5 or 6 weeks, Hitler abandoned his own initial sense of urgency, disregarded his field commander's emphasis on haste, and postponed the operation until early July. While the Führer delayed, the soldiers moved. In Model's sector, 20th Corps, with 4 infantry divisions, would hold down the 9th Army's right flank. Next came 41st Panzer Corps. It had only a few tanks under command, but its 4 infantry divisions were as good as any in Russia, and expected to fight their way deeply enough into the Russian defenses to draw their reserves away from Modul's Schwerpunkt. That was provided by 42nd Panzer Corps, Panzer divisions, and another good infantry division, commanded by Lieutenant General Joachim Nielsen, who had commanded Modul's forces since 1938 and had no illusions about what he was expected to do. Next to Nielsen was another Panzer Corps, Josef Huss's 41st. With the 18th Panzer Division, 2 infantry divisions, and several battalions of heavy armored vehicles, Huss's corps was Nielsen's left shoulder to cover his advance and develop his success. The 23rd Corps, which concluded Modul's sector to the east, was tasked with mounting a secondary attack toward the town of Maloarkhangelsk. It had 2 infantry divisions and a one-of-a-kind assault division, an experimental formation whose strong component of anti-tank guns would make it possible for the Corps to hold any positions captured. In reserve were 3 mobile divisions, 2 Panzer and 1 Panzer Grenadier, motorized infantry with some armored half-tracks. These were under Kluge's control, not Modul's, and would be committed only when a breakthrough was secure. Modul thus commanded in total around 335,000 men, 600 tanks, and 300 assault guns. These were tank chassis with guns mounted in the hull. Their heavier caliber made up for limited traverse compared with their turreted counterparts. There were no Panthers, and a single Tiger battalion would join Nielsen's corps only at the start of the attack. As compensation, Modul received 2 battalions of Ferdinands, 88mm assault guns built on the chassis of a Tiger design rejected for production. Often dismissed by critics because of their bulk and because they lacked machine guns for close defense, the Ferdinands drew no criticism from their crews or the infantry, who welcomed their big guns as tank killers and bunker busters. The Second Army held the salient's nose. With 7 understrength infantry divisions and fewer than 100,000 men, it was assigned no role in Citadel beyond maintaining the link between the 9th Army and Army Group South, which was configured to do the heavy lifting. Modul's deployment reflected what was expected, a straightforward collision of men and tanks, with the Germans essentially muscling their way through the Russian defenses. Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had to perform a trifecta, break in, break through, and break out into the rear of the salient. To do it, Hoth had almost 250,000 men, including some of the best troops in the German army. Hoth formed his Schwerpunkt by allotting the left half of his sector to 52nd Corps and its 3 infantry divisions. In the center, 48th Panzer Corps had an infantry division as maid of all work, 2 Panzer divisions, and the elite Grossdeutschland division, GD. Designated a Panzer Grenadier, or mechanized infantry division, Grossdeutschland was configured as a full-fledged Panzer division and was at the head of the Wehrmacht's list for replacements and equipment. The Corps also included an independent tank brigade with no fewer than 200 brand-new Panthers, giving it a total of around 600 armored fighting vehicles. Next to 48th was an arguably even more formidable instrument of war. The SS Panzer Corps had 3 divisions, 1st Leibstandarte, 2nd Das Reich, and 4th Totenkopf, the pick of the litter in Heinrich Himmler's already metastasizing Waffen-SS. They had fought separately until assembled for Manstein's counteroffensive in early 1942, and earned reputations as warriors who never expected quarter and gave it only when convenient. Designated Panzer Grenadier divisions, they were panzer formations in all but name. The Corps had around 500 tanks and assault guns, including 42 Tigers, and each division had 6 Panzer Grenadier battalions, 2 more than their army counterparts. Neither Otto von Knobelsdorff of 48th Panzer Corps nor Paul Hauser of SS Panzer Corps, the Corps' official title was changed to 2nd SS Panzer Corps in June, but the original title remained in common use during Citadel, particularly stood out among the senior panzer officers as tacticians. The British phrase "good plain cooks" is not damnation with faint praise here, but both had reputations as soldiers' generals, with the decorations to prove it, and Citadel did not look like the kind of battle that would offer much opportunity for finesse. Should that quality be required, Hoth had an ample supply of it. In the spring of 1943, he was the most experienced, and in many judgments, the best Army-level commander of mobile forces in the German Army. He had led a corps and a panzer group in 1940 to 1941, survived Hitler's purge in the winter of 1941 to 1942, taken over the 4th Panzer Army in June 1942, and taken it to Stalingrad and beyond in a series of virtuoso performances that impressed even Manstein. And through all that, his men called him Pop, Vati. Much depended on him. Hermann Hoth expected to deliver. Army Detachment Kempf stood on Hoth's right. This was an ad hoc formation above a corps but below an army. It had 9 divisions by early July, 3 of them panzers in 3rd Panzer Corps commanded by another comer, Hermann Breit. Werner Kempf was the right man to oversee Breit's debut in high command. He had led a brigade, a division, and a corps well enough to be promoted to the ad hoc force bearing his name in early 1943. Manstein trusted him, as good a recommendation as any tank man might wish. Kempf's detachment was originally intended as a blocking force, but its role grew as it became apparent that the defenses on its front might be a little less formidable than those facing Model and Hoth. Breit's corps added an infantry division, then a Tiger battalion to its original strength of more than 300 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, a formidable strike force in its own right, able to create opportunities as well as exploit them. Army Group South had reserves as well, an Army Panzer Division and the 5th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Viking. But with only around 100 tanks between them, they were more Derringer than belt gun, better able to restore positions or exploit situations than to turn the tide of battle by themselves. They came, moreover, with a string attached. The Army High Command had to approve their commitment, a virtual guarantee of delay and distraction under conditions demanding Manstein's total concentration. By this time, what wave of German infantry division belonged to was more or less irrelevant. The ones assigned to spearhead the offensive usually had solid cadres of veterans and as many replacements, and as much new equipment as the overstretched rear echelons could provide. As late as mid-May, fewer than 400 recruits and convalescents had on average reached Model's division. They would go into action as much as 20% under strength, a level even higher in the rifle companies. Training was another problem. Attacking the kinds of positions mushrooming in the Kursk salient was a specialized craft, and field commanders were willing enough to trade the offensive's repeated delays for a chance to improve training and increase firepower, giving their men a better chance in the close quarters fighting to be expected. The mobile troops were no less weary. By the end of the winter's fighting, the 18 panzer divisions in the east were down to around 600 tanks. Motorized battalions were moving on foot and by wagon. Friedrich von Mellenthin, 48th Panzer Corps' Chief of Staff, widely accepted in post-war years as a final authority on mobile operations, declared that hardened and experienced panzer divisions were ready for another battle as soon as the ground dried. But Mellenthin was a staff officer, a bit removed from the sharp end. Hoth informed Manstein on March 21st that men who had been fighting day and night for months now expected a chance to rest. Even hard-charging regiment and division commanders had to drive instead of lead because of widespread apathy in the ranks. Staff officers and line officers alike were openly critical of Citadel's repeated postponements, but delaying the attack provided the breathing space, the Wehrschnaufpause, the Germans so badly needed. It gave the newcomers a chance to shake down and the old hands a chance to relax. Gerd Schmuckle, who would end a long and checkered military career as deputy commander of NATO in Europe, in 1943 was a junior officer in a panzer division. His memoirs nostalgically recall elaborate alfresco dinner parties, friendly Russian peasants, visits to the Kharkov Opera, and one particular ballerina. There was even time to put on a show for a delegation of Turkish officers, clean shaves, clean uniforms, and all medals on display, with a cameraman on hand to record a tiger put through its paces for the benefit of the Reich's newsreels. The backdrop for all this was a build-up like few had ever experienced. Reactions, even among the cynics and grumblers, oddly resembled those widespread in the British Expeditionary Force in the weeks before the Battle of the Somme in 1916. This time, there was just too much of everything for anything to go seriously wrong. Ironically, the Russians were coming to a similar conclusion. The Soviet victories at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus had not been won in isolation. On January 18th, the Red Army had opened a corridor to the besieged city of Leningrad. Small-scale actions in the central sector had also favored the Soviets. Evaluating the results, Stalin interpreted the success of Manstein's post-Stalingrad counterattack as anomalous. He believed Soviet forces could shift directly to the offensive and win decisively. In response, the Soviet High Command initially planned a major offensive, a deep battle, initiated by sequential attacks on a front extending from north of Smolensk down to the Black Sea, followed by theater-scale mechanized exploitation. But the price of recent Soviet success had been high. The Germans, against expectations, had staged another remarkable recovery. Stalin might cultivate an image as Vozhd, supreme leader, source of all wisdom and authority. He may have been able to strike mortal fear into the most senior of generals and party officials, but he had learned the risks of taking immediate counsel of his own confidence. As Chief of Staff Vasilevsky noted, Stalingrad in particular added an operational dimension to his chief's thinking. In an order of the day issued in February, Stalin acknowledged the German army's recent defeat, but noted that there was no reason to assume it could not recover. It would be stupid to imagine the Germans will abandon even a kilometer of our country without a fight. Like many of the Red Army's common soldiers, Stalin understood, viscerally, if not always intellectually, that the long retreat during the summer of 1942 could not be repeated, whatever the prospective advantages of further overextending the invaders. For practical purposes, there was nowhere left to go. Stalin understood as well, however unwillingly, that the kinds of strategic offensives the Red Army had conducted since the winter of 1941 had a way of turning into poorly coordinated, systematically mismanaged, hideously costly sector attacks, no matter how heavy Stalin's hand might lie on the responsible generals. Should a reminder have been necessary, the still incomplete relief of Leningrad was a depressing account of operations depending primarily on mass, impelled by callousness and brutality, grinding forward a few miles, then stalling as much from internal frictions as from any German efforts. Commanders and formations alike showed repeated, glaring ineptitude in reconnaissance, communications, and combined arms operations. One of the Soviet Union's major advantages to date had been the ability to renew its forces to a degree impossible to the overextended Wehrmacht. But even Russia's resources, human and material, were not infinite. Significant evidence indicates Stalin seriously